So when we take in food, we're not just taking in nutrients. We're taking in everything about that food, where it was grown, the energy of the elements, right? The sun exposure that it had, the moon exposure, the rain, the things that stressed it in its environment. You're taking in even the shape, the sacred geometry of that food, whatever its shape is.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Her Daily Rhythm. My name's Natalie Smythe. I'm your host. If you haven't met me, I'm a naturopath and meditation teacher, and I'm on this journey with our partners from Bird, and they're really focusing on democratizing women's health and supporting women from menstruation to menopause. So they've got so many different masterclasses to check out. In this episode, we are interviewing someone that I would deem a hero and someone that I admire so deeply, and that's Dr. Deanna is a nutritionist, scientist, international lecturer, educator, and author with over 20 years experience in academia and the food and dietary supplement industry. And she has been active in functional medicine, clinical trials, and her own trials in her own practice in food and spirit. And she is the author of several incredible books on wellness topics, 4 chapters, and over 50 scientific publications. And through all of her engagement, she really helps people transform their lives practically and artfully through nutrition and lifestyle. So, in this episode, we really explore the relationship between nutrition, color, spirituality, and particularly focusing on Dr. Deanna's philosophy of the rainbow diet. So, Dr. Deanna Minich explains how different colored foods support various parts of the body and the significance of dietary diversity for gut health and reducing toxic load. And we delve into the 7 rhythms of life, from the circadian rhythm to seasonal rhythms to hormonal and metabolic processes, which we talk about all on here on Her Daily Rhythm. And so she really emphasizes how intentional, joyful engagement with food can enhance your physical and spiritual practice. So I've learned so much from Dr. Deanna Minich over the years, and you will too. And I think this episode really bridges the gap between what we speak about in traditional Ayurveda and modern science too. So you're really in for a treat. As always, let me know what you love.
Dr. Deanna, your bio really doesn't encapsulate the reverence and the contribution that you have made to nutritional science, particularly merging the art and science is so beautiful. And certainly your work has profoundly influenced how I see the world, not just through the lens of nutrition, but as that language of color and rhythm and feminine intelligence, really maybe what inspired me to co-create Her Daily Rhythm. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's good to reconnect with you and to get this message about color, science, and spirituality out to a larger audience. So I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion.
Exactly. So we are speaking about really your main body of work is the rainbow diet. So what is the core philosophy of the rainbow diet, and why is color so essential, especially for women?
Yeah. And I like how you intro this with macro and micro, because I do think that our human bodies are like the microcosm of the macrocosm, the planet, right? And so when we learn about ourselves, we learn about our ecosystem. So when I think of the rainbow diet, which isn't really a diet per se, but it's a philosophy, it's a way of life. So I see it in 4 different categories. So the rainbow diet comprises of color, creativity, diversity, and rhythm. And so
Hmm.
each of them are the pillars upon which we can look at the rainbow diet and see how it affects our daily lives. So when we talk about color, because we could start there because that's the obvious connection to the rainbow diet. With color, we look at all of those different phytochemical signatures within foods and how each of those phytochemicals have a functional signature within our bodies. So when you
Hmm.
look at red colored foods like cherries and apples and raspberries, tomatoes, a lot of different polyphenols, vitamin C, different nutritional actives and phytochemicals to help support our adrenals and our stress response system. Then you look at orange and the carotenoids, which would supply a lot of the different plant compounds to help support healthy hormones. Then we look at yellow for the digestive tract. We look at green for the heart and vessels. We look at blue, green for the thyroid, we think of sea plants and different kinds of, I would say, green plants that grow in the blue ocean. And
Mhm.
then we look at blue purple, which connects to the brain. And then finally, we look at white. White is also part of this spectrum of colors. And white would connect to not just white sugar, white flour, white salt, but looking at the healing white foods, coconut, garlic, sesame seeds, cauliflower. And also, just to bring into that spectrum of colors that I just mentioned, there's also black, which belongs as part of the blue purple spectra, and also brown and tan and beige, which I put together with the yellow color category. It's
Mm.
more rainbow, and it's, I would say, the entire spectrum of different colors and how we need each of those colors, because if we don't get one of those colors, we start to miss a function in our everyday life.
Mm. And I think you've brought it back really to basics because it is that evolution of Ayurveda. A lot of our audience, they've spoken to Ayurveda practitioners, and the diets and the doshas seem quite confusing for people. When we bring it back to the color or the pigments or the phytonutrients, it can merge everything and it has that accessibility. And when we see in radiating color, because I think maybe as women too, we're more drawn to color, we're removing the complexity of things and getting stressed, because then when we're stressed about something, that causes more overwhelm on our systems too.
And keeping it simple is really key because dietary patterns come and go, whether it's
Mm,
carnivore, keto, paleo, Mediterranean. And I think that what unifies us as people is color. So
mm,
a 5-year-old understands color just like a 50-year-old and an 80-year-old. It's like we can all rally around eating the whole spectrum of different colors found in nature.
mm. I'm also noticing that a lot because I'm in Africa right now and deep in a rural village too. So they only actually have access to what nature provides. It's very seasonal. So right now, watermelon season has just closed. And so now all you see is mangoes, papayas. And it's so interesting too, because I'm not used to the microbiome, like the landscape here with my digestion. And a lot of Westerners have maybe been getting a little bit ill, but what they do here naturally is when you have a salad, there's all of these spices, and there's a lot of these black spices, which I haven't really seen so much in Europe. So it always happens very naturally, and we've lost that natural rhythm of eating that is within us.
It is within us, and it's what connects us to nature's intelligence. That's the fourth pillar of the rainbow diet is rhythm, which you are
Hmm.
really keyed into, right? So it is a seasonal rhythm that you just spoke to. It's
Hmm.
also the circadian rhythm, so the day-night cycle. It's also menstrual rhythms for women. And even when women don't have a menstrual cycle anymore, they're still keyed into a rhythm in their bodies, a hormonal rhythm. And I would also say the lunar rhythm. There's just the rhythm of the place that we live in. So you're in Africa, I'm in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Each of those places have a little bit of their own unique rhythm to them, which then leads to the growing of certain foods that would be good for those respective regions. Like you mentioned, mango season,
Mm.
right? Where I live, it's more blueberries and it's apples. And so, just different kinds of foods to help support where we live and what our needs would be.
Mm. And I wonder maybe if you could expand a bit on those seven rhythms, because perhaps people haven't heard so much about them. I know there's a lot of research in circadian rhythm, and people are trying to understand that there's your menstrual rhythm. But for somebody in a city, in an urban environment, getting up, going to work, who is so out of touch from their environment around them, what could they do or how could they understand those rhythms?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so let's kind of go through rhythms. I would say the first rhythm that we're connected to is the planetary rhythm, which is two things. One is the circadian rhythm, which is the day and the night cycle. And so we are primed to be sleeping and to be awake. And that is connected to our exposure to darkness and to light. So having that
Mm.
rhythm every day, that 24-hour cycle, which is actually very pivotal for things like digestion, our physical activity, and even our hormones. For example, cortisol. which is a stress hormone, and testosterone, which is a hormone of action and driving us forward and giving us motivation. Both of those are very high in the morning. Then they start to go down through the day, right? Because we want to be active during the day and not so much as it goes into nighttime. So that's circadian rhythm. The planetary rhythm that we have unique to Earth is seasonal rhythm. So depending on where you live, you may encounter 2 seasons, kind of winter and summer, or you have 4 seasons. And those seasons lead to different transitions or shifts in the environment that lead to different, I would say, changes in food, trees, plants, the microbiome. All of that is changing us pretty significantly. So there's that. And then think about, I touched on it already, but hormonal rhythms. So we have something that most women would know about, the menstrual cycle, the 28 to 30-day, I would say, rhythm of estrogen and progesterone in the body in order to foster healthy ovulation. But then you also have other types of hormonal rhythms. You have andropause, which is the lowering of testosterone through one's lifespan. You have menopause, the
Mm.
lowering of estrogen and progesterone in a woman's life. You have adrenopause, kind of the lowering of cortisol. So it's kind of like we are all tethered and connected into hormones in a
Yeah.
way that is very cyclical. It's very predictable in that way. In addition to hormonal rhythms, there's also metabolic rhythms, and that's why many times people will hear not to eat so late in the evening because your metabolic rhythm is not at its peak. And we know that in Ayurvedic medicine, we know that in traditional Chinese medicine, we know it even in Western scientific research, right? So there
Mhm.
is the metabolic rhythm, right? The heart has its own rhythm. I would say the brain has its own rhythms and waves that happen. So, at the end of the day, you can look back and say, we're very rhythmic in our beingness. So things come, things go, yin, yang, the 5 elements, and all of these things really come into play from this dynamic dance of interrelationship.
Hmm. It's a really creative lens to look at things. And I suppose you presenting this information, or how are you noticing people taking up this information? Because I generally live in London. And so it's the complete opposite how I live my life as a practitioner. So I guess my question is, what are you noticing from people's experiences? Is it because they're so far away from their rhythm and they're craving back this cyclical living and connection?
Think so. It's
Mm.
really interesting what's happening out there, I would say, within the health trends and the health space. You can look at biohacking, people trying to live longer and live better. And how do you do that? You can use technology. You can also look at populations that already are doing that. And if you look at a lot of the different populations that are living longer, what you tend to see is that they're very close to nature. They
Mm.
actually are very opposite to technology. And I think that's what we have lost because one of the biggest, I would say, disruptors to our hormones and to living healthy and long and having a good quality of life is exposure to artificial light at night.
Mm.
Now, in Africa, I don't think you have that as much, but if you look at the planet from afar, you can start to see how hyper illuminated everything is and how it's increasing. We're trying to increase productivity. People are living well into the night when they could be sleeping. They're on devices, they're on phones, they're on computers. I think that this is very disruptive, and we're starting to see that this is playing into our brain health, even looking at things like risk for dementia, risk for Alzheimer's disease based on this disruption of our sleep wake cycle. So I think people are truly waking up to it in a variety of different ways. I mean, even for myself, I have always focused on nutrition, but not always focused on when people eat, right? But that's also a huge factor to consider. It's not just what you eat, it's when you're eating and what food you're eating throughout the year. So I think that that is something for us to consider and something that has been regarded in traditional ways of healing and eating, but somehow we've lost our way.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that the light pollution is contributing to Alzheimer's and dementia, because I actually asked this question the other day here as what are the cases of dementia or what do old people die from here in West Africa? And they said that dementia, Alzheimer's doesn't exist, which is fascinating.
That is fascinating. In some ways, perhaps no surprise because of their lifestyle, living close to nature. And another thing in Africa, in my experience of being there, is that there is this symbiosis between the animals, plants, and people in a way of when we look at whether it's the United States or Europe or other countries, there is this sanitization, this
Mm.
phobia around microorganisms. And I just think of how in Africa, certain groups of people just living in harmony with nature. And, kind of we would look at some of these things like, oh my goodness, we can't have that where we live. But, I think that we have been so far removed from nature in the way of like sanitizing our space. But yet we have this fear of molds, mycotoxins. It's perhaps we just need to learn how to live in harmony with a lot of these, I would say, whether it's parasites, fungi, the viruses, a lot of these things have co-evolved with us. So why is it in Africa you can have more exposure to these things, but not get affected in the same way as being in the West or in Europe and having these exposures and falling ill? I think part of it too is around stress. The level of stress really does change us as people. It changes our physiology, it changes our psychology. And perhaps in Africa, there's more community. There's more focus around everybody and how you are interconnected to people. So I wonder if the level of stress just isn't as great as what you would find in other countries where there's more isolation. Again, another risk factor for things like dementia and other types of chronic diseases.
I was going to touch on that point. It's certainly that community and that nourishment, and there is no such thing as care homes and things like that. They just don't
Right.
exist. And it's a different type of stress too, a modern day stress. We've made our lives easier, but have we still, evolutionary, our biology hasn't shifted.
True.
Yeah.
But there's just an honoring of rhythms in other countries too, waking up with the sun, going to bed at night, and then also kind of looking even at, I'm curious how it is in Africa with respect to even the moon, kind of the connection to celestial bodies, right? And so just really being in tune with those different rhythms overall. What have you learned in that respect?
Yeah, I like the children are, and I've only been here for months, so I've been trying to notice it with the moon as well and the crescent because the children are out playing because it's so hot here. Obviously, it's 40 degrees right now, and the children do everything later, but they don't need as much sleep. But also noticing right now I'm in the dry season, so it's very hot. When the wet season comes, that will be very different. But certainly they are up at 6 a.m. in the morning. But they still go to bed quite late too, but they have these naps. They have these naps throughout the time. And also interesting what I noticed is these 3 meals a day. There's no snacking too. So you really have that break in between your meals and every like fight there's so many herbs and spices and everything for protection, for your microbiome, to protect from viruses. Water is the main problem here of sanitization and things like that. I'm going off piste a little bit, but they have high concentrations of bladder cancer here. And that's because there's a bacteria in the water that is causing that. So I thought that was quite interesting.
It is interesting. On the other side, I would think that based on what I know about the different diets in Africa, there's higher fiber.
Mm,
So there a lot, probably, this will take us into this one of the other pillars of the rainbow diet, which is diversity.
mm,
I think that the last time I was in London, which was October of last year, you go into the market, you go into the grocery store, and basically you see a set amount of plants, produce, food products, and you find that, basically it's kind of whittled down into, probably 100 to 300 different species is what has been projected. But if you look at ancestrally and what we have evolved with, it's something on the order of 1,000 to 3,000 different plants and different species, right? And I think that in Africa, all of this fiber, all of these phytochemicals, I just feel that there's probably more diversity within a lot of those different microcultures in Africa versus in the United States or Europe, where it's much more limited. And also, usually food is imported from other places. So it's not native to that area.
Mm.
So it comes to diversity too. I think just to toss this in, looking at about 50 unique plant foods in 7 days seems to be the benchmark. Between 30 and 50, different studies say different things, but usually many people are doing the same foods over and over again, right? So we need more diversification.
I think that's a great thing that you highlighted, and I know your book speaks about this too, because constantly from women, well, social media, it's like, I need to take supplement, I need to take this, I need to take this. But as you say, the metabolism and the restriction in a supplement is so different to the diversity of food and how that's encapsulated and how that encapsulates light and the fiber and all of the unique concentrations in it. So I do actually have a little bit of problem with compliance when I talk about that you need to take, well, I don't say 50, I've seen the literature of even just 30 unique plant foods. But how can you tell our listeners explain to our listeners the importance or how easy it is to incorporate into their weeks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, if you don't measure it, then you don't know what you're actually taking in. So it's good to get a baseline. So I've created a worksheet where people can just basically track on a daily basis what they have. And it's fun to create a game out of it too. Like, don't make it just another thing to analyze, but make it a fun thing to do with other people. So, as an example, what you can do too is take a picture of the meal and then start to count things up. And I count things like spices and herbs as well. So, if I have a curry powder with 11 different spices, which I actually do have something like that, then I count all 11 as part of that diversity. But if I had that same curry powder the next day, we could not count those same spices, right? I'd have to go and figure out, oh, let me use a Mediterranean blend of spices to get even more. This is where things like soups, stir fries, where we have more complexity in a meal is beneficial, right? That's where we can start to leverage some of the different food preparation ways to cultivate that. Another way would be herbal teas. So I was just looking at my teas yesterday. Many of them are blends. So it's not just straight green tea, it's green tea with pomegranate, with other things in that. And that's what you want. You want to select for more diversity. So you can tell that we're not talking about quantity here, we're talking about quality. And so it's not that it has to be half a cup of legumes or, I think if we just look at a benchmark of just tallying up the number of unique plant foods that we have, then it becomes easier to do and more fun to do. And then you start to get the hang of it. When I was at the store the other day, this past weekend, um, let's just take apples. Apples is something where you have many different varieties depending on where you live. So instead of going to the store and buying a large bag of the same kind of apple, you can do is take 1 minute and self-select different varieties of apples, and already you have greater diversity.
Wow. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
and diversity within a species, it's not
Mm.
just like you have an apple, you have a banana, it's diversity of the apple. Diversity lettuce would be a great one, right? Because you could have arugula, you can have spinach, you can have bib lettuce, romaine. There could be all kinds of lettuces. There could be microgreens, and all of that would be unique and count towards the diverse number that you need.
And that color diversity also impacts your whole endocrine system.
Yes, let's just give everybody kind of like the science of that. So, why is diversity important? Because it helps to give you a better gut microbiome, right? Because the gut microorganisms like diversity. Diversity is a principle of nature. So, if you have the same thing all the time, you're just going to have the same bacteria doing the same things, and you don't create this polyculture of where they're each helping each other. Good gut microbiome means better immune system, means better brain. It can also translate into better mood and mental health. So there are some studies on that looking at the association between dietary diversity and looking at reduced anxiety and better mood in certain populations. You can also have a better nutritional status. So if you're eating from a diverse blend of foods, you're actually getting many different nutrients rather than just concentrating a few. And that would also apply to toxins. If you think about pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides that can make their way into food or on food, if you're eating the same foods all the time, those undesirable compounds could also bioaccumulate. They can increase. So it's kind of a protective mechanism to have diversity for a better nutritional status, but then also to reduce one's toxic load. So making even a brand, if you normally buy the same brand of butter, change it up. Right? Change up the type of oil that you might buy, extra virgin olive oil, change up the tea brand. So it's not just the within a brand, it's also the brand itself. I think it's important to look at diversification. You might choose a farmer's market, like an outdoor market to go to, where you're going to have very different things. Then you're going to go to maybe a mainstream market, maybe a smaller store. So diversity is not just the food, it is where you shop, brands that you buy, the different varieties within one species. So it's actually quite vast how you think about it.
It's the whole ecosystem, or it's a whole like a way of living and being. And I suppose maybe then for people that do work in the city and they're not at home and maybe can't prepare food or but travel. I know you travel a lot, so you're our perfect example of this. What would you say to women that are like, I don't have time for this, I've got children to look after, etc., etc.?
Well, you still have to go grocery shopping or do shopping in some way, right? So that's at your point of purchase is where you can make selections. So maybe it's introducing one new food a week and you start there. Maybe it's about incorporating more spices into food, which makes the food more medicinal and more flavorful. So I would say you just have to start with one step. It doesn't have to be perfect, but involve the kids as well. I think that with children, they really, I mean, you can involve them in the food preparation and also in the game of eating and what that involves. So if they're making a pizza, you can create a rainbow pizza, right? It doesn't have to be just a few, like one or two things on the pizza. You can actually put broccoli, you can put red bell pepper, you might want to put pineapple. There could be several things that you're adding to the pizza that actually encourage diversity. So even think about it with breakfast, like when eggs scramble or with scrambled eggs together with other vegetables, right? And that's how you emphasize more diversity. And one good thing to note, because what I hear from mothers is that it's challenging to get their children to eat vegetables, right? But there is a study in which they showed that when children were presented with three different servings of vegetable, three different kinds of vegetables versus one kind of vegetable, they actually had more diversity and they chose to eat more vegetable overall when they had choice, when they had the three versus the one. So I think our human minds, we like diversity. We like to change things up. That's why, like, sometimes we go shopping for clothes when we don't really need clothes, but we just want to change things up, right? So we are primed for diversity, and children especially would like that kind of diversity. So to involve them in that process to help you.
It's that participation in we're inquisitive beings, aren't we? And so it's that
They
play.
are.
It's that play and creativity. And I know creativity is a part of your pillar in this diet. I think it is through the color as well. But how does creativity play into this piece, particularly for women as well, in supporting their reproductive organs?
Creativity is one of those lesser known aspects of healing. Before I would say medicine became medicine, private practice, we referred to these types of, I would say, modalities as the healing arts. because healing is an artful, soulful, creative process, right? It's not always just a straight line. You have this symptom, take this. Many times there are many layers to it. So creativity to me involves flow, fluidity. It's how we think, how we involve our emotions. So an example of how women could bring creativity into food would be to make a new recipe, to try something new, to actually maybe even not use the recipe and just use their own creativity. So recently, I'll give you an example of this. Looking at some of the recipes, like if you can't eat certain things or you're trying to eat healthier, instead of making brownies from a mix, looking into, there are chickpea brownies where you bring in cocoa and all kinds of very creative, tasty ingredients, but in a creative matrix or a formulation that normally would not be kind of mainstream. So it's newer for women. And also being creative about, I would even say, the food preparation and food presentation. So there can be all different things. Like I've created a card deck where, it's all about inspiration and around food. And so leaving that on the dining room table. Maybe there's a color on the plate. Maybe instead of a white plate, you try a blue colored plate and see how that feels. Or creativity has no bounds. It could be creating a new rhythm, creating a new dish, creating a new way and style of eating. It might even be painting your kitchen a different color to connect to a different feeling that you want in your kitchen. So creativity,
Mm.
I would say, is such an essential ingredient to life overall, not just food, but it's our essence, right? Because we're creating in our bodies. For some women who are having children, we're creating through dance, through speech, through movement, through art. Some women like quilting or knitting or sewing. Some women like craft and different hobbies. So I feel like all of that is very important for health and healing at the end of the day. So I feel that that is overlooked. So when I do talk color with the rainbow diet, there is an element of creativity or play or fluidity. Like instead of being so structured with food, let's open it up a little bit more and let's try this food. Let's try this recipe. Let's have a meal with this person.
Mm.
So when I live in Europe, one of the things I noticed about Europeans versus Americans is that there was a lot of connection with just inviting somebody over on a Thursday evening to have a meal.
Mm.
And it didn't have to be a huge meal. I think in the United States, we have this thing of, if you invite people over for dinner, it has to be more, just like a bigger thing and,
Sure.
kind of in a yeah. But when I lived in Europe, it was like, no, it's just kind of a casual thing. I'll just come over to my place, make a stir fry or something very easy, not very involved.
Mm.
So there's also the element of community as it relates to creativity, and women love that connection. Depending on the community that we cultivate, right? Because we can have a supportive community, we can have a non-supportive community. When we choose accordingly and have this conscious community, it can be very important for overall health and well-being.
Mm.
So that's where creativity could go. Creativity could actually go into a lot of different directions, but those are just some ideas to get us started.
Mm. I love that too. It's just bringing it back to the source of who we are. You know, we outsource ourselves, don't we? But as you say, it's that essence of who we are. And so much can change and shift. Like I noticed, I was, when you get a little bit stressed, you're in the future or in the present. But then if you just remember joy and that dance or shift the energy or flirt, all of these things that you spoke about, it shifts so much, which I can imagine changes all of your biochemistry in real time as well.
It's true. When we're stressed, we become different people. We are not operating in the zone or in the flow or in this coherent way. We're kind of in a stuck, stagnant, and then we just kind of default to the lowest denominator of where we could be. But stress can be used and catapults us forward in the way of our resilience, right? I mean, we can't exist without stress. We're here because of, we are learning, and a lot of those lessons come through the vehicle of stress. So I feel like we don't want to reject stress in the way of thinking that it's bad. But if we think of it as growth, as a way to flow and become more creative, then we can have a different invitation to stress in a way that we may not normally see it. So we're actually injecting a little bit of creativity into it, into our perception of it.
I really love that. I know you speak about a lot as how our heart and our ovary connection connects together, and it's through that also that piece of creativity and also connecting to our heart. So it's the heart ovarian connection. And you speak about the endocrine pairings with this vibrational frequency and how they're merged together. I wonder if you could speak about that, how they're interlinked, they're not separate.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. That's a good one. So, as you know, being that you have studied with me over the years, we have this internal circuitry, and it does stem back to ancient traditions where they already knew that we had these points of connection within us, and they had symbolic colors that would connect. And even now, with modern science, we see that this is like the endocrine system. When I think of women and I think of the feminine within us and where we operate throughout that whole system, but I would say that there are some interlocking areas where there's even more like synergy or potentiation. And that would be within our reproductive tract. So if we think of the uterus, the ovaries, and I would even extend that into the adipose tissue or our fat tissue, because actually our subcutaneous fat, our visceral fat stores are a source of hormones. Many people don't realize that and they try to get really thin, they lose that body fat, but then we lose the reservoir of hormones that we need later in life. So I kind of see the reproductive hormonal aspects of estrogen, progesterone, that raw creativity, the fertility aspects being then connected. If I think of the heart to me is like the upper sacred container, almost like if the uterus was the lower incubator of creative expression for women, the heart is like the upper incubator of joy, passion, our life force, what we feel. And so, if we just think of like the reproductive system is like this orange color of play, warmth, exploration, raw emotion, then I think of the heart space as more like a forest. It's more like, it's green. It is nature based. It's more going up and out into the world and expanding. And so I think that these two things do connect within us and they have this relationship. If we fall in love with somebody, we can choose to create with them.
Mm, mm,
And so that physical creation, it can be an emotional creation, it can be something more mentally creative as well. So,
mm,
we have this whole circuitry, and I tend to see it in 7 different unique systems, but there are some systems that kind of play together. And so having that reproductive system in women connected to the heart, it just makes sense that there is this connection. And even the foods that we have, like the orange colored foods, there are studies that show that when women have more orange colored foods, it's almost like they are helping the health of their ovaries because many of those orange colored compounds localize into the ovaries and seem to be helpful for ovulation. So having more of certain ones of these, like beta cryptozanthin, so we see this with tangerines, mangoes, persimmons, oranges. These orange round fruits give us certain plant compounds that seem to help our ovaries to be healthier. So that's good, right? And if we eat a lot of orange foods like carrots, many times our skin can turn an orangey color, right? Because it kind of lodges in the fat tissue, the subcutaneous fat. But that can also work to our benefit in some ways because it can be like an internal protection. And those carotenoids can help with just healthy adipose tissue. And then the heart, when I think of foods for the heart, I think of green foods, things that have leaves and seeds. And, we're looking at things that are high in magnesium and folate and vitamin K1. So a lot of the leafy greens would be important for helping our blood vessels to expand, those dietary nitrates that we take in. So when we feel expansive, we feel expressive. When we are contractive, then we are more rigid and we are more in that stress mode. So that's why I would say that the reproductive system and the heart, they have that connection between expansion and expression. We can also be expressive and then create that expansion as well. But those two things kind of go hand in hand.
Mm. It makes me think of now we're hearing, perimenopause. I have my friends, early 30s, mid 30s, and like, oh my God, I'm studying menopause by this hysteria in the news. And then beyond menopause too, it makes me think of that we do contract our heart and we don't honor our wisdom and we don't honor our creativity, we don't honor our flow, all of these things that you speak about. So I wonder, is there maybe anecdotally or what you notice when you lose touch with that creation, when you lose touch with your heart, that can stand symptoms of these perimenopause and post as well?
Yeah, I have noticed that actually. I mean, if we just look at hot flashes as an example. So when a woman has that kind of sympathetic state, that heat rising in the body, she turns red, she's sweating, maybe that interrupts her sleep. This is actually connected to the cardiovascular system, the sympathetic nervous system, right? So there's a dysregulation. And many times, what we would think of from a medical perspective is if a woman has hot flashes, we need to be looking more closely at her cardiovascular health.
Mm.
And that might also imply a stress response or looking at the health of her adrenal glands, her immune system, her inflammatory responses, like all of that would be very relevant, right? So if a woman has tended to those things in the previous decades of her life, so she's tended to healthy sleep, she has tended to her stress with yoga or meditation or eating well. Typically, she will have less of those things appearing during a vulnerable time like perimenopause, where now we lose the protection of hormones and everything is front and center. And so I do think that menopause is a very transformational time for a woman. And even though it can feel a little bit rocky when a woman is going through it, she can embrace it, moving into the seat of her wisdom, moving into the second half of her life to give her strength, to give her courage, to give her this sense of beingness in her body, mind, and spirit in a way that she hasn't really known before. I feel that if women had that as the overall template, rather than kind of shirking and kind of like looking at it as something to fear and feeling like, oh, I don't want to go through that. I feel that the more work we do earlier in life to increase our consciousness, to increase our health, to increase our well being, we have less of this tumultuousness that can happen as our hormones start to go down. Because without the veil of a lot of those hormones, it's like our true self starts to emerge, right? We don't have the change our moods, to change our behaviors, right? It's not all of that now settled. And she is truly in that state of who she is, no matter who she is at that time of her life. So it's a time of discovery, it's a time of inner alchemy, it's a time of how do we maximize grace, wisdom, and a sense of presence that is truly required for that second half of life.
I think that really summarizes actually everything so well. It's how can you honor yourself and be in harmony with connection of your biology, your spirit, your soul, your creativity, everything that you speak about. And your book guides and your life purpose is us. There's one thing that I want to touch on just from a personal perspective because I love how you speak about it, about your work, and I think what you love finding in the literature as well is how light is impacting food and our cells, and it's a new body of research, isn't it? But I certainly have observed this. So I wonder.
I would say research emerging around quantum medicine, quantum nutrition, quantum health, quantum healing. I think we've always known about these things, but not in the way that we know about them now with technology. So the essence is that when we take in foods, we can unleash ATP, energy. We can get the energy currency to do things. But that comes at a cost. And that cost is through the mitochondria, which are in the cells. Those mitochondria are producing a lot of these reactions to get energy and giving off a lot of what we call light or photons. So everything that's living gives off photons, actually. And so it's just that we can't see those things. We can't see the little sprays of light, right? But too much light given off could mean that there could be oxidative stress or a burden to the mitochondria. So that's why, in some way, I think of this play on words like enlightenment. What does that really mean? And when I think of enlightenment from a spiritual perspective, I think about how do you cultivate the light within you? Are you doing that through internal practices like going within? It's almost like re regulating, whether it's the stress response, the metabolic response, the mitochondrial response, so that we're not constantly giving off and spraying our energy, right? And again, that's measured as biophotons. Bio just meaning life, photon light. So there are research ways to measure this in food. Food on its own, as the food decays, you might start to see more of that energy being released from the food. So then a food eventually decays, goes bad. It's not giving us that same life that it could be giving, right? So there is more and more, I would say, discovery and talk about looking at the quantum effects of food. So when we take in food, we're not just taking in nutrients. We're taking in everything about that food, where it was grown, the energy of the elements, right? The sun exposure that it had, the moon exposure, the rain, the things that stressed it in its environment. You're taking in even the shape, the sacred geometry of that food, whatever its shape is. And I would encourage people to look at shape, right? And just like I mentioned, orange foods that are round tended to be good for the ovaries, which, in some cultures, we would call that the doctrine of signatures, kind of looking at what's the nature. A walnut is shaped like a brain. It could be good for brain health. What we can be looking at is the color of the food, being fed by that through our eyes, looking at the shape of the food to see like what is the resonance. Am I eating a lot of circle foods? What about like foods in different shapes? How does that make me feel? Like when I cut into like red cabbage, kind of the beauty of that and just like really being connected to that, the food's creativity, right? That place of connection with food. And I feel like beauty, art, all of that can be seen just even through that preparation. So it doesn't have to be drudgery. In that way, I call all of those things quantum. Quantum is often referring to light, but I think it's also referring to small things that have great impact, right? So light, sound, the sound of a melon when you shake it, right? Really going beyond just like the mere, I would say, the physical nutrition and into the subtle nutrition. How does it sound? How does it taste? What is the feeling you get from that food? So I feel like that's more of a well-rounded, I would say, probably physical and energetic way to see foods coming into our lives and feeding us on multiple levels.
It's witnessing the whole sensory experience that food is far more than nutrition, it's nourishment, as you speak about.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, your whole self through that process of eating. It's not just getting the calories for energy, but it's connecting very deeply. So actually eating can become a spiritual practice. And what is spirituality? The sense of meaning and purpose. So finding that sense of meaning and purpose through food in our everyday meal preparation, which most women might find to be drudgery. But if we catapult that forward into something that can increase our consciousness or enhance our spirituality, if we choose to see it that way, it has great potential.
It's that intentional shift. Even catching yourself, oh my gosh, I'm cutting this, someone's screaming at me, or da-da-da. It's like, okay, now where's
Yes,
the beauty, the smells, the whole essence of it?
It's so true.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Deanna. I know we have to run now, but where can people find you? What are you working on? I think you've got another course coming out. Your book is out. You have numerous books. Where would you like people to find you?
I would say my website would be the best place. So it's deannaminich.com, DeannaMinich.com. And on there, you'll see blogs, you'll see free downloads, you'll see my social media handles. We'll have a certification program emerging, all kinds of courses. So sign up for the newsletter that's on the homepage of the website because that's how you find out what's happening and what's on the horizon.
Your newsletter, everybody, is incredible. There's so much research information that can fit into everything that we've spoken about. So thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to speak with you again.
Thank you.